Harold Thompson shuffled through the glass doors of Mercy General Hospital at exactly 10:45 p.m., just like he had every night for the past 12 years. His worn security uniform hung loose on his thin frame, and his weathered hands gripped a thermos of black coffee that would keep him company through another long shift. At 68 years old, Harold moved slower than he used to, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. The night staff barely acknowledged him as he made his way to the security desk. To most people, Harold was just part of the furniture, an old man with a badge who checked doors and made sure visitors signed in properly. The younger nurses whispered that he was probably just waiting around to collect his pension, and the doctors rushed past him without so much as a nod. Harold had become invisible in plain sight, but Harold didn't mind being overlooked. He had learned long ago that being underestimated could be an advantage. While others saw a frail old man, Harold saw everything that happened in his hospital. He knew which nurses were struggling with personal problems, which doctors worked themselves to exhaustion, and which patients needed someone to simply sit and listen. What nobody knew about Harold was the small wooden box he kept locked in his apartment dresser. Inside that box were medals, commendations, and photographs that told a very different story about who Harold Thompson really was. The Purple Heart sat next to a bronze star, and beneath them lay a faded photograph of a much younger Harold in marine dress blues, standing proudly with his platoon somewhere in Vietnam. Harold had served 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps sergeant. He had led men through some of the bloodiest battles of the war, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of every soldier who served under him. But when he returned home, Harold never talked about his service. The war had taken too much from him, friends, innocence, and a piece of his soul that never quite healed. After the military, Harold had worked various jobs: construction, factory work, driving trucks across the country. But as his body aged and his knees began to ache from old shrapnel wounds, he needed something quieter. The security job at Mercy General was perfect. It was peaceful, steady work where he could help people without anyone asking too many questions about his past. Harold had never married and had no children. His parents had passed away years ago, and most of his old Marine buddies had either died or lost touch. He lived alone in a small apartment a few miles from the hospital, where he spent his days reading military history books and tending to a small garden on his balcony. His life was simple and quiet, exactly the way he preferred it. The hospital staff knew almost nothing about Harold's background. His personnel file listed him as a veteran, but nobody bothered to look deeper. To them, he was just Harold, the old security guard who never caused trouble and always showed up on time. They had no idea that the man they barely noticed had once commanded respect from some of the toughest soldiers in the world. As Harold settled into his chair for another night shift, he pulled out a small notebook where he recorded his rounds. Each entry was precise and methodical, old habits from his military days that he never lost. He may have been dismissed by most people, but Harold Thompson continued to serve with the same dedication and honor that had defined his entire life, even if nobody was paying attention. 3 months into Harold's 13th year at Mercy General, something happened that would change how a few people saw him. It was a busy Tuesday evening when 18-year-old Marcus Rivera was brought into the emergency room. The young man had been in a serious motorcycle accident and was unconscious with multiple injuries. His family rushed in behind the ambulance, panicked and desperate for information. Marcus's grandmother, Elena Rivera, was particularly distraught. She spoke very little English and was confused by all the medical terminology and hospital procedures. While the doctors worked on Marcus, Elena sat in the waiting room, clutching her rosary and crying softly. The nursing staff was too busy to spend much time comforting her, and her family members were dealing with their own grief and fear. Harold noticed Elena during one of his rounds. She was sitting alone in a corner looking lost and frightened. Without hesitation, Harold approached her and knelt down beside her chair. In fluent Spanish, he gently asked if she needed anything. Elena looked up in surprise. She hadn't expected the quiet security guard to speak her language. Harold had learned Spanish during his time in the Marines, serving alongside many Hispanic soldiers who became his closest friends. Over the years, he had kept up with the language by reading Spanish newspapers and watching Spanish television shows. Now, for the first time in years, his language skills became useful again. Elena poured out her fears to Harold. Marcus was her youngest grandson, a good boy who worked hard and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Harold listened patiently, offering words of comfort and reassurance. He explained the hospital procedures in simple terms and helped Elena understand what the doctors were doing for Marcus. Throughout the long night, Harold checked on Elena regularly. He brought her coffee and a blanket, and when she became too anxious to sit still, he walked with her through the hospital corridors, continuing their conversations in Spanish. Other family members began to notice how much calmer Elena became when Harold was around. When Marcus finally woke up the next morning, stable but facing a long recovery, Elena grabbed Harold's hands and thanked him through tears. She told him he was an angel sent by God, and Harold quietly replied that he was just doing his job. But Elena's son, who had witnessed Harold's kindness throughout the night, made sure to thank Harold personally and ask for his name. Word of Harold's compassion began to spread slowly through the hospital. A few nurses noticed how he had helped the Rivera family, and they started paying more attention to the quiet security guard. They began to see that Harold wasn't just walking his rounds. He was actually watching over everyone in the building with genuine care. Dr. Sarah Chen, a young resident who had been at the hospital for only 6 months, was particularly impressed by what she had witnessed. She had seen Harold comfort Elena with such natural kindness that it made her reconsider her own bedside manner. Dr. Chen made a mental note to observe Harold more closely during her shifts. The Rivera family visited Marcus every day during his recovery, and Elena always made sure to stop and chat with Harold in Spanish. She brought him homemade cookies and told him stories about her family. For Harold, these brief conversations became the highlight of his shifts. It had been years since anyone had treated him like more than just a uniform, but most of the hospital staff remained oblivious to Harold's growing connection with certain patients and families. To them, he was still just the old security guard who worked the night shift. They had no idea that Harold's simple act of kindness toward one frightened grandmother would soon lead to discoveries that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. Dr. Sarah Chen couldn't shake her curiosity about Harold Thompson. After witnessing his interaction with the Rivera family, she found herself observing him more carefully during her night shifts. What she discovered surprised her. Harold wasn't just a security guard going through the motions, he was deeply invested in the welfare of everyone in the hospital. She watched Harold comfort a young father, whose wife was in labor with complications. She saw him sit with an elderly man who had no visitors, reading him newspaper articles to pass the time. Harold seemed to have an instinct for finding people who needed help, and he approached each situation with remarkable patience and wisdom. One particularly busy night, Dr. Chen was treating a veteran who had come to the emergency room having a severe panic attack. The man was disoriented and agitated, refusing to let anyone touch him. The standard protocols weren't working, and the situation was escalating when Harold quietly appeared beside Dr. Chen. "May I try talking to him?" Harold asked softly. Dr. Chen was desperate and nodded her approval. Harold approached the veteran slowly, speaking in calm, measured tones. Within minutes, the man's breathing began to slow. Harold sat down beside him and began talking about things that seemed completely unrelated to medicine. The weather, baseball, simple everyday topics. But Dr. Chen noticed something subtle in Harold's voice, a tone of understanding that went deeper than casual conversation. The veteran began to relax and eventually allowed Dr. Chen to examine him properly. Later, as they were completing the paperwork, the veteran thanked Harold specifically, saying that Harold understood things that most people couldn't. Dr. Chen's curiosity reached a breaking point. During a quiet moment later that shift, she approached Harold directly.
"Harold, can I ask you something personal?"
"You have a way with people that seems to come from experience. What did you do before working here?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. He had spent years avoiding this question, but something about Dr. Chen's genuine interest made him decide to open up slightly. "I was in the military for a while," he said simply. "You learn to read people to know when someone needs help." "What branch?" Dr. Chen asked gently. "Marines," Harold replied. "Vietnam." Dr. Chen felt a chill of realization. She had assumed Harold was a veteran, but Vietnam veterans were from a different generation entirely. Harold would have been very young when he served, and the war had been brutal. Suddenly, his quiet strength and his ability to connect with troubled patients made perfect sense. "Thank you for your service," Dr. Chen said quietly. Harold nodded but didn't elaborate further. However, Dr. Chen's respect for him had grown enormously. She began to wonder what other secrets Harold carried, and why someone with his obvious people skills and life experience was working as a night security guard. Over the following weeks, Dr. Chen made an effort to engage Harold in conversation during their shifts. She learned that he was incredibly well-read, especially about history and current events. He had thoughtful opinions about everything from politics to medicine, but he never pushed his views on others. Harold was a listener first, a quality that Dr. Chen recognized was rare and valuable. Dr. Chen also noticed that Harold had developed relationships with several regular patients. There was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who came in for dialysis treatments and always asked Harold about his garden. There was Tommy, a young boy with leukemia whose parents worked night shifts, leaving him alone during his treatments. Harold would sit with Tommy and tell him stories about his adventures, carefully edited versions of his military experiences that focused on friendship and courage rather than conflict. The more Dr. Chen observed, the more she realized that Harold Thompson was having a profound impact on the hospital community. Patients remembered him, families requested him specifically when they had questions, and even some of the other night staff had begun to rely on his calm presence during difficult situations, but Dr. Chen was still the only staff member who had bothered to learn anything substantial about Harold's background. Most people continued to see him as just an old man with a security badge. They had no idea that they were working alongside someone whose life experiences had prepared him to handle almost any crisis with grace and wisdom. Harold's simple routine at Mercy General was disrupted one cold February morning when he didn't show up for his shift. Harold had never missed a day of work in 13 years, not for illness, not for vacation, not even for severe weather. When 10:45 p.m. came and went without Harold walking through those glass doors, the night supervisor, Janet Walsh, began to worry. Dr. Chen was working that night and immediately noticed Harold's absence. She asked Janet if anyone had heard from him, but Harold had never given anyone emergency contact information beyond what was required in his personnel file. The hospital had a phone number for his apartment, but no one answered when they called. By midnight, Dr. Chen couldn't concentrate on her work. Something felt wrong. Harold was too responsible, too reliable to simply not show up without calling. She convinced Janet to give her Harold's address, claiming she would drive by his apartment to check on him during her break. Harold lived in a modest apartment complex about 15 minutes from the hospital. When Dr. Chen knocked on his door, there was no answer. She could see that his car was in the parking lot, which made her even more concerned. After talking to the building manager and explaining that Harold might need medical attention, they agreed to do a welfare check. They found Harold unconscious on his bathroom floor. He had suffered a stroke sometime during the day and had been lying there for hours. Dr. Chen immediately called for an ambulance, and Harold was rushed to Mercy General, the same hospital where he had worked faithfully for 13 years. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Harold, who had spent over a decade taking care of others in that building, was now a patient in the intensive care unit. Dr. Chen made sure Harold received the best possible care, and she took personal responsibility for monitoring his condition. Harold remained unconscious for 3 days. During that time, something remarkable happened. Word spread through the hospital about Harold's condition, and people began to visit. Elena Rivera came with her entire family, bringing flowers and prayers. Mrs. Patterson from dialysis brought a small plant from her garden. Tommy, the young boy with leukemia, drew Harold a picture of them together. Dr. Chen was amazed by the stream of visitors. She hadn't realized how many people Harold had touched during his years at the hospital. Patients who had been discharged months or even years ago somehow heard about Harold's condition and came to check on him. Families who remembered his kindness during their darkest hours made the trip to show their support. The hospital staff began to take notice. Nurses who had barely acknowledged Harold for years started asking about his condition. Even some of the doctors who had never bothered to learn his name inquired about his prognosis. Janet Walsh, the night supervisor, felt guilty for knowing so little about someone who had worked under her supervision for over a decade. When Harold finally woke up on the 4th day, he was confused and disoriented. The stroke had affected his speech and mobility, but his mind was still sharp. Dr. Chen was the first person he saw clearly, and he managed to whisper a weak "thank you" when she explained what had happened. The doctor treating Harold was honest about his prognosis. Harold would recover, but he would need extensive rehabilitation. His days of working night shifts and walking hospital corridors were over. Harold listened to this news with quiet acceptance, the same way he had faced every challenge in his life. But Harold's biggest concern wasn't his own health. It was his job. He worried about leaving the hospital without proper notice, about letting down the people who depended on him. When Dr. Chen assured him that his job would be waiting for him if he recovered enough to return, Harold smiled for the first time since waking up. What Harold didn't know was that his hospitalization had sparked conversations throughout Mercy General. People were finally asking questions about the man they had worked alongside for years. Janet Walsh had pulled Harold's personnel file and was shocked to discover that it listed him as a decorated Marine veteran. She realized that she had completely overlooked someone remarkable, and she wasn't the only one feeling that way. The revelation that Harold was a veteran began to spread through the hospital, and people started to understand why he had such a natural ability to help others in crisis. But even this discovery was just the beginning of what they would learn about Harold Thompson. Harold's recovery was slower than anyone had hoped. The stroke had left him with weakness on his left side and difficulty speaking clearly. He spent weeks in rehabilitation, working with physical therapists and speech therapists to regain his abilities. Throughout his recovery, the stream of visitors from the hospital continued, and Harold was overwhelmed by the support he received. Dr. Chen visited Harold almost every day. During one of these visits, she noticed that Harold seemed troubled by something beyond his physical condition. When she gently asked what was bothering him, Harold struggled to find the words. Finally, he managed to explain that he was worried about his apartment rent and medical bills. His insurance would cover some costs, but Harold had very little savings. This concerned Dr. Chen greatly. She couldn't understand how someone who had worked steadily for 13 years could have so little financial security. When she delicately asked Harold about his finances, she learned something that shocked her. Harold had been sending most of his paycheck for years to support the families of Marines who had died under his command in Vietnam. Harold explained haltingly that he had made a promise to himself after the war. He had survived when some of his best men hadn't, and he felt responsible for taking care of their families. Harold had been quietly supporting 3 families for decades, paying for children's school supplies, helping with medical bills, and sending money for emergencies. He had never told anyone about this, considering it a private obligation. Dr. Chen was stunned by this revelation. Harold had been living on almost nothing, so that he could honor his fallen comrades. She realized that Harold's simple lifestyle wasn't due to lack of ambition or drive. It was the result of incredible generosity and loyalty that had lasted for over 40 years. Dr. Chen felt compelled to share this information with Janet Walsh, who was equally amazed. Janet began to understand that they had all completely misjudged Harold Thompson. He wasn't just a simple security guard. He was a man of extraordinary character who had been quietly serving others his entire life. Janet decided to dig deeper into Harold's military record. Using the limited information from his personnel file, she contacted the Veterans Administration and made some phone calls to veteran organizations. What she discovered left her speechless. Harold Thompson wasn't just a veteran. He was a highly decorated Marine who had served with distinction in some of the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. His service record included multiple commendations for bravery, leadership medals, and a Purple Heart for injuries sustained while saving wounded soldiers under enemy fire. Harold had led rescue missions, commanded troops in combat, and had been personally recommended for promotion by several superior officers. Janet learned that Harold had been offered opportunities to attend officer training and make the military his career, but he had chosen to complete his service and return to civilian life. His military records painted a picture of a natural leader who had earned the respect and loyalty of everyone who served with him. Armed with this information, Janet felt she had to do something to help Harold. She organized a small fundraiser among the hospital staff to help with his medical expenses. When she explained Harold's situation and shared some details about his military service and his ongoing support of fallen soldiers' families, the response was overwhelming. Hospital employees who had barely noticed Harold for years suddenly wanted to contribute. Doctors wrote generous checks, nurses organized bake sales, and even patients who had heard about Harold's situation donated money. The fundraiser raised far more than Janet had expected, enough to cover Harold's immediate expenses and provide him with some financial security. But Janet wasn't finished. She felt that Harold's service and character deserved broader recognition. She contacted the local veterans organizations and shared Harold's story. She also reached out to a reporter from the local newspaper who specialized in veteran stories. The reporter was immediately interested in Harold's story. A decorated Marine who had spent decades quietly supporting fallen comrades' families while working as a night security guard was exactly the kind of story that needed to be told. The reporter visited Harold in the rehabilitation center and was struck by his humility and grace. Harold was reluctant to be interviewed at first. He had spent his entire life avoiding attention and publicity. But when the reporter explained that his story could inspire others and bring attention to the sacrifices made by Vietnam veterans, Harold agreed to talk. He had always believed that the real heroes were the men who hadn't made it home, and if his story could honor their memory, he was willing to share it. The newspaper article about Harold Thompson appeared on a Sunday morning and created an immediate sensation. The headline read, "Local Security Guard Secret. Decorated Marine Still Serving After 40 Years." The story detailed Harold's military service, his decades of supporting fallen soldiers' families, and his quiet acts of kindness at Mercy General Hospital. By Monday morning, Harold's room at the rehabilitation center was flooded with cards, flowers, and visitors. The story had been picked up by other newspapers and local television stations. Veterans organizations from across the state were calling to offer support and honor Harold's service. The story resonated with people because it represented the best of what it means to serve others, without seeking recognition. But the most surprising visitors came on Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Chen was sitting with Harold when a group of men in military uniforms appeared at his door. The leader introduced himself as Master Sergeant Rodriguez from the local Marine Corps recruiting station. Behind him were 6 active duty Marines who had read Harold's story and wanted to meet him personally. Harold was overwhelmed by their visit. These young Marines treated him with a respect and reverence that he hadn't experienced in decades. They understood the significance of his service in ways that civilians couldn't. Master Sergeant Rodriguez presented Harold with a certificate of appreciation from the Marine Corps, acknowledging his continued service to Marine families long after his discharge. The Marines spent an hour with Harold, listening to his stories and sharing their own experiences. They were amazed by Harold's humility and his reluctance to talk about his own heroic actions. When they learned about his financial support of fallen Marines' families, several of them quietly asked Dr. Chen for information about how they could contribute to Harold's cause. Word of the Marines' visit spread quickly through military networks. Within days, Harold was receiving visits from veterans from multiple branches of the military. A group of Vietnam veterans from the local VFW post came to welcome Harold into their brotherhood. They had been trying to connect with Harold for years, but he had always kept to himself. Now they understood why. Harold had been carrying the weight of his service and his responsibilities alone for 4 decades. The attention was difficult for Harold to process. He had spent his entire adult life avoiding the spotlight, preferring to serve quietly in the background. But he began to understand that his story was having a positive impact. Young Marines were inspired by his example of lifelong service. Families of fallen soldiers were comforted to know that their loved ones were still remembered and honored. Hospital staff were learning valuable lessons about not judging people by appearances. Harold's physical recovery continued steadily, but it became clear that he would not be able to return to his security guard position. His mobility was limited, and the long hours of walking hospital corridors were beyond his capabilities. This reality saddened Harold, who had found purpose and meaning in his work at Mercy General. Janet Walsh, however, had a proposal for Harold. The hospital administration had been so impressed by the outpouring of support for Harold and the positive publicity surrounding his story that they wanted to create a new position for him. They offered Harold a job as a patient advocate and volunteer coordinator, work he could do sitting down and at his own pace. The position would allow Harold to continue helping people while accommodating his physical limitations. Harold was touched by the offer, but he was also concerned about the financial implications. The new position paid less than his security guard salary, and he still had obligations to the families he supported. When Janet learned about this concern, she had another surprise for Harold. The fundraising effort that had started at the hospital had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. Veterans organizations, community groups, and individuals who had read Harold's story had contributed thousands of dollars. There was enough money to ensure Harold's financial security and allow him to continue supporting the Marine families without worry. Harold was moved to tears when he learned about the generosity of so many strangers. For the first time in decades, he wouldn't have to choose between taking care of himself and honoring his commitments to fallen soldiers' families. The weight he had carried for so long was finally being shared by a community that understood and appreciated his sacrifice. As Harold prepared to begin his new role at the hospital, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The man who had been invisible for 13 years was now celebrated and honored. But Harold knew that the real value of his story wasn't in the recognition. It was in the reminder that every person has hidden depths, and that service to others is its own reward. Harold Thompson worked for another 3 years at Mercy General Hospital, in his new role as patient advocate. His office became a gathering place for people who needed someone to listen, and Harold's wisdom and compassion touched hundreds of additional lives. He organized support groups for veterans receiving treatment, helped families navigate complex medical situations, and trained hospital staff in ways to better serve patients with military backgrounds. During those 3 years, Harold's story continued to inspire others. He received letters from Marines serving around the world who had heard about his decades of supporting fallen soldiers' families. Several military families traveled great distances to meet the man who had helped them through difficult times, without ever expecting recognition. Harold discovered that his quiet acts of service had created ripples of kindness that reached far beyond what he had ever imagined. Harold also reconnected with some of his old Marine buddies who had lost touch with him over the years. The newspaper article had helped them find him, and these reunions brought Harold great joy. They shared memories of their service together, and marveled at how Harold had maintained his commitment to their fallen brothers for so many decades. In the spring of his 74th year, Harold began to notice that he was slowing down more than usual. Simple tasks were becoming difficult, and he found himself feeling tired most of the time. After several medical tests, doctors discovered that Harold had developed lung cancer, likely related to his exposure to chemicals during his military service in Vietnam. Harold faced this diagnosis with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. He continued working at the hospital as long as he was able, and when the treatments became too demanding, he reluctantly retired. The hospital held a celebration in Harold's honor, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched over his 16 years of service. As Harold's condition worsened, he was cared for by many of the same medical staff who had once overlooked him. Dr. Chen, now a senior physician, made sure Harold received the best possible care. The Marines who had visited him years earlier continued to check on him regularly. The families he had supported for decades sent cards and letters expressing their gratitude for his years of generosity. Harold Thompson passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in November, surrounded by people who had come to understand his true worth. Dr. Chen was holding his hand when he died peacefully in his sleep. His last words were a message of thanks to everyone who had shown him kindness during his final years. Harold had left instructions that he wanted a simple funeral service. He had never sought attention in life, and he didn't want elaborate ceremonies in death. He requested that instead of flowers, people should donate to organizations that supported military families. Harold had also arranged for his few possessions to be distributed to people who had been important to him during his final years. The funeral home expected a modest gathering for Harold's service. After all, he was an elderly man with no immediate family and few close relationships. They prepared for perhaps 30 or 40 people to attend. When the day of the funeral arrived, they were completely unprepared for what happened. Cars began arriving hours before the service was scheduled to begin. The parking lot filled quickly, and vehicles lined the streets for blocks around the funeral home. Marines in dress uniforms served as honor guards, and veterans from multiple wars came to pay their respects. Hospital staff, former patients, and families Harold had helped over the years all came to say goodbye. But the most stunning moment came when 50 active duty Marines arrived in formation to honor Harold Thompson. They had traveled from bases across the region to attend the funeral of a man they had never met, but whose story had inspired them. These young Marines understood that Harold represented the best traditions of their corps: loyalty, honor, courage, and commitment to others. The funeral service was standing room only, with hundreds of people spilling out into the parking lot. Speaker after speaker told stories of Harold's kindness, his service, and his quiet heroism. The Marines who had known his story shared how his example had influenced their own commitment to service. Hospital staff spoke about the lessons they had learned from watching Harold work. As the service concluded and the Marines carried Harold's casket to the cemetery, the crowd followed in a procession that stretched for miles. Harold Thompson, the security guard everyone had dismissed, was being honored by a community that had finally learned to see his true worth. At the graveside, Master Sergeant Rodriguez delivered the final tribute. He spoke about how Harold's story would live on in the Marines who had been inspired by his example. He promised that Harold's commitment to supporting military families would continue through the foundation that had been established in his honor. And he reminded everyone present that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who serve quietly, without recognition, simply because it's the right thing to do. Harold Thompson had spent his life being overlooked and underestimated, but in death, he received the recognition he had never sought in life, the acknowledgement that he was a man of extraordinary character who had made the world better through his service to others.